Every winter I get asked questions about breaking ice, and whilst this is something that I really got familiar with probably 10 years ago when I first got back into my match fishing. One of the venues that I specialised on, particularly through the first winter and second winter, was a fishery at Messingham, and that's where I wanted to learn how to fish with soft pellets on the pole for F1s, for carp, for crucian carp as well. There are lots of them in there, and that's where I really went to focus on that. I used to do it through the summer, but then in the winter obviously it became really quite specialised, fishing with certain rigs that possibly I'll show you one day if I end up in that scenario again. But as you can expect, going through winter there were times when we had to break the ice, and it was quite a common occurrence, to be fair, certainly that first year. And so we found that there were different ways of breaking the ice. Now, the first thing that I will say about breaking ice is that we are doing it less and less now, I think, generally, because what we tend to see now is that I think with the influx of attention that goes on into health and safety, there are lots of fisheries out there now that they would rather close the match off and just say, look, the match is cancelled or the match is postponed, rather than just run the match in those conditions. But I think it's also a reflection as well is that there perhaps aren't as many people out there that seem to enjoy breaking the ice as what there used to be. Lots of those anglers are older now, and if they've got the option not to break the ice, then they won't. So whilst I'm just going to share this with you about how I cut holes out in the ice, I think it's fair to say that it is a less common occurrence now. But if you are into that style of fishing, lots of pole fishing through winter, then it can be a useful thing to know about. Now, I'm no expert, but I know how to break ice. I've been doing it for many years. But again, this is a behind the scenes look at the kind of kit that I use and just the way that I do it. It's not complicated. The first thing I will say is that if you are going to go and break the ice, first thing, I know you're probably expecting this, and that is just pay attention to your own health and safety. Some platforms on fisheries, some banks can be, by the very nature, because it's iced over, the bank can be very icy as well. So please be very, very careful if you're going to go out and break the ice. All right, that's the first thing. The next thing as well is whatever sort of an icebreaker you use. If you're fishing a pleasure session, for example, first thing that I strongly recommend you do is when you arrive at your peg or at the fishery, just have a look at how thick the ice is, because I've seen it before where I've seen people unload their car or their van, load up their barrow, walk 10 pegs, get to their peg, unload the barrow and everything, then get their icebreaker out, whatever it is they're using, and they've gone like that and it's bounced across the ice because it's not heavy enough to get through the actual thickness of the ice that they're faced with. And so they've ended up not being able to fish. Or I've seen them with weights going like this over the... I mean, there are times when you've got to just throw the towel in sometimes. So if whatever you're using to break your ice isn't strong enough, you really want to find that out before you've unloaded your car. Just a little tip, that's all. I've seen it happen before. Now, as regards the actual equipment, we'll talk about that first. Basically, I've used different things over the years. For many years, I used to use I've seen the round weights that go onto dumbbells. They look like big polo mints, big hole in the middle. For years I used that, and that was fine. I used to use one of those, and that would always break me a hole out, no problem. However, these days, depending on the thickness of the ice, there are cleverer ways of doing it, and so by using a weight like the one I've just described, that basically breaks the ice. It smashes it. So it smashes it into lots of different pieces. You get your landing net then and just go around and scoop all the ice out, and that's when you end up with a massive mountain of ice on the bank next to you. That is one way you can do it. All right, I'm not saying there's a right or wrong way, but that's one way of doing it. But the other way that we've done for the last few years is to use more of an ice cutter than an ice breaker. All right, so rather than just a big weight that's just going to smash into the ice and smash loads of pieces off it, we have more specialised cutting equipment. As you can see, this is my icebreaker that I use now, or if you want to call it an ice cutter, I think that's probably more appropriate. As you can see, this has been designed for the job. All right, so you've got a nice big heavy weight there, as you can see. Then you've got this long arm here, and then you've got that section there, and that's the key. it's not the main part, because you need all these parts for this to work. But basically, as you can see, if I turn that end on, that is basically a blade. As you can see, it's been sharpened, and that is designed to cut through the ice. And this can, you know, with the right technique, these can just make the job so much easier, which is something that I'm going to show you in a minute. So that is the business end. As you can see, you've then got a length of chain, which can be very, very important, because that's the bit that can be constantly rubbing on the ice. When I throw that out, it smashes through the ice. As it sinks down, this chain is then rubbing right on the edge of that ice where it's just punched a hole. And if that wasn't a strong material, then it could easily snap, it could easily break and wear. Plus, with it being a chain, it actually adds to that saw effect of cutting through the ice as well. So that's a short piece of chain, and then I've got a rope, a length of rope, and I've always found that the best way of carrying it, because you've got to think about transporting all this, you could have it in a bag, but obviously with long lengths of rope and stuff, it can get tangled up, and you don't want to be messing about on the bank, do you? With something like this, as you can see, you just wrap it round, it's never going to tangle, it's always going to be okay. And that is it. All right, so as regards actual breaking it, one thing that will make the job easier is a pair of gloves. That will always make the job easier, because the water's ice cold. You know, you've got to have the right tools for the job to make it yourself more efficient and make the experience a little bit more enjoyable as well. All right, the next thing then, before you start throwing that out there, is take off a couple of layers. As you can see, I'm wrapped up now, and on many cold mornings like this, you're gonna have some layers on. Trust me, you know, I've learnt this the hard way all those years ago. Take a couple of layers off. Your body is naturally going to get warm, you're going to start sweating. If you've got all layers on like this, all that's going to happen is you're going to start sweating a lot more. Your clothes are going to get wet and damp underneath. But then what you're going to do then is, you know, you're going to spend the rest of the day then sat in wet clothes. And when it's cold out here, your body's warm. It's a recipe for disaster. You know, it can lead to colds, flu, all sorts of problems. I found that out the hard way. And today, this morning, when I was cutting this hole out, as cold as it is, I was actually in my t-shirt, because I got that warm doing it, and I was still warm for a half an hour in just my t-shirt. That's how warm you can get. And then when I started going cooler again and getting chilly, I could put my top layers back on that were nice and dry and warm, and I've stayed warm all day. So the technique is really quite simple. You basically throw that out, that will punch through the ice. As it sinks to the bottom, you can then start to retrieve it. And because of that heavy weight, the heavy weight actually stays beneath the ice. It stays in place. If it was too light, as you pull it, it could have a tendency to flick out and back on top of the ice. And you don't want that. You want that to stay in the water under the ice. And then you just basically bring the rope back, and it just causes a sawing effect. That sawing effect actually cuts through the ice, and it's amazing how straight and accurate you can be when all that is working correctly. One thing that I will say to you, the actual technique, you could actually just pull it in short bursts like that and kind of nibble and chip away at it. That can work. However, today, for example, I found out that simply walking back in a line was far more effective. So rather than just doing that and trying to cut my way through it, all I did was I gave it one big pull and then continued walking back with it, and that way I could cut sections as long as that in one go. It was much quicker. Do that once, and then towards the left hand side of your swim, if you then put it in again, I've literally got a hole there that's about that wide at the furthest point. So I've dropped one spot in there, and then the next one went in there, and when you get two punctures in the ice like that, they will crack across to each other. And by doing that, you actually end up with two lines or two cuts in the ice. And by just shoving it sometimes with a landing net handle, you can get that to break off into one big piece of ice. What you can then do, if you've achieved that, if you've done that bit right, you've then got the majority of what the ice is in front of you is one big slice of ice. What you can do then is, if you press down one end of that section of ice with your landing net handle, just push it down so that some water can actually get on the top of it. that will weight that end down, which means at the other end you can then quickly and easily just move over to the other side of it, and with your landing net handle you can actually push that one big sheet of ice underneath the rest of the ice. Once you get the technique right, you know, depending on the thickness of the ice, so as you can imagine, the thicker the ice, the more difficult it is to do this, because you've got to push that ice further down in the water because it's thicker. With thinner ice it's much easier. But once you get that right, you can then push that one section of ice underneath the rest of the ice, and all of a sudden it just opens up a really nice clean hole. You're still going to have bits of ice there that need scooping out, but that only takes a minute or two. So spending a bit of time in getting that bit of kit right, thinking about your technique. No, it's not just a case of just throwing it out anywhere, and just plan it out in your head how you're going to do it. By doing that, you can save yourself at least half an hour. If you can cut big sections of ice out like that as one big sheet and push it out of the way, you're saving all that time of having to spend ages scooping all that ice out, which can be very, very time consuming. And ultimately it makes the job a little bit more difficult as well, doesn't it? I think I've summed the whole process up there for you. If there's any bits that I've missed out, or if you've got any questions, as always, please post them below. But I hope you've enjoyed this little bit of an insight into something that, you know, I've been doing for the last 10 years, and having not done it for a while, today I was able to cut these two channels out behind me within about 20 minutes.